Okay, welcome everyone to TVA Daf Yomi. This is our fifth lesson, and today we are actually going to be finishing Masechet Taanit, and this is very exciting as we have been learning together for the past 5 weeks, Masechet Taanit. And today we're going to review Daf 26 through 31. Okay, so Daf 26, we're going to begin and complete the fourth chapter in Masechet Taanit. We have the Mishnah that tells us that the priests, the Kohanim, would bless the people 4 times a day, 3 times in the year, meaning 3 times a year, they were actually going to bless the people 4 times a day. In the morning prayer, in Shacharit, in Musaf, the additional prayer, in Mincha, the afternoon prayer, and in Ne'ilah, which is a special prayer that is added. We're very familiar with Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, but the Mishnah tells us that not only Yom Kippur, but on fast days, we have added tefillah, an added prayer, and during the Maamadot. The Maamadot, we're going to learn about what that means. And basically, as we said, that 3 times a year, the Kohanim are going to be blessing the people 4 times a day. So the Mishnah explains to us, what are these Maamadot? Maamadot means that we know that they're communal sacrifices brought every day and throughout the year in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. These sacrifices needed somebody to be present. We know that when an individual brings a sacrifice, the individual needs to be there when the sacrifice is brought. The Mishnah explains that so too when a communal sacrifice is brought, a representative of the community needs to be present. And therefore, we are going to have, if you remember, we learned about the 24 shifts of Kohanim who would work in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash every week, right? That was a shift that went through every week. The Mishnah explains that there is going to be a parallel shift of Leviim, of the Levites, and of Yisrael, meaning of the people of the nation, that are going to parallel the Kohanim, meaning that these people are also going to be present, and we'll see what that means in a minute. So there are 24 shifts of the Kohanim and 24 Maamadot. Maamadot are going to be everybody else, meaning Leviim and Yisrael, who are going to come to Jerusalem. So it seems the Mishnah tells us that the Kohanim, the priests, and the Leviim, the Levites, would come to Jerusalem, and the Yisrael, meaning the people of the nation, they would actually stay in their city, and they would go to the shul. What would they do in the shul? They would actually fast from Monday to Thursday. The Gemara is going to explain why they don't fast on Sunday or on Friday, but they're going to fast on Monday through Thursday, and they're going to read certain verses from the Torah. The Mishnah tells us from Ma'aseh Breshit, meaning from the creation of the world. They're going to read those verses in the shul, a little bit every day, in the morning and in the afternoon, Shacharit and Musaf. On Erev Shabbat, meaning on Friday, they would prepare for Shabbat. And then they didn't necessarily read from Maaseh Breshit. They wouldn't read from Maaseh Breshit, from the Torah, if that day was a day that they said Hallel. It seems it would be too much, so they would say Hallel. Or if Musaf was said, and the Gemara is going to explain what this means, or if there was something called the Korban Eitzim, the sacrifice of the wood. We're going to see what this means. The Mishnah explains that there were 9 days in the year that they brought a special wood sacrifice. And this was a minor festival. Remember, we spoke about previously this concept of minor festivals throughout the year. So this was a minor festival for the families that volunteered to bring this wood. And the Gemara lists the exact date and who brought the wood. The Mishnah is going to explain exactly what's going on here. The Gemara is going to explain it a little bit later. Let's continue in the Mishnah. On Aleph Tevet, meaning on Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of Tevet, which we just had last week, there was no Ma'amad because they said Hallel, right? Again, because it's Chanukah, so they say Hallel. And it's also Rosh Chodesh, and they say Musaf. And it was a time that they brought the Korban Eitzim, the sacrifice of the wood. So therefore, there are so many things going on, they didn't add to it on that day. The Mishnah continues and tells us about the 17th of Tamuz, what we call Shiva Asar B'Tamuz. This is one of the fast days commemorating the events that led up to the destruction of the temple. And the Mishnah actually tells us about 5 things that happened on this day. The tablets, the luchot, were broken. Right, again, right, Moshe brings the tablets down. He sees the sin of the golden calf, and he breaks the tablets. That happens on the 17th of Tammuz. The Korban Tamid, the daily Korban, the daily sacrifice that was brought in the temple was stopped on this day, on Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, on the 17th of Tammuz. The city was breached in the second temple, and Apostomus was actually burnt a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, on this day, and there was an idol that was put in the temple on this day. The Gemara says either Menashe put it in or Apostimus, but somebody put an idol in the temple courtyard. The next sad day, since we're talking about tragic days and fast days. Again, we're finishing up Masechet Taanit, so we're finishing it up with the major fast days. So Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, we just mentioned, the 17th of Tammuz, and Tisha B'Av, right, the 9th of Av, famously was when the temples were destroyed. So the Mishnah tells us that actually 5 things happened on that day. It was decreed on that day that the Jewish people wouldn't enter Israel. This is during the sin of the spies, right? The Meraglim, when the spies came back and said, Israel is terrible, we shouldn't go. And that's when everybody got nervous, and God said, you know what, forget it. You guys aren't going into Israel. That happened on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av. The first and the second temple were destroyed. Beitar, which is a city, and it was also a refuge during the time of Bar Kokhba, of the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. Beitar was destroyed, and that was basically the end of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. This was 52 years after the destruction of the temple. And the same day, Jerusalem, not that year, but the same date was when Jerusalem was razed to the ground, meaning completely destroyed. The Mishnah continues and tells us that we need to limit pleasure when Av starts, right? Famously, we say Mishin Nichnas Av. When Av, the month of Av starts, we decrease simcha, right? Happiness and pleasure. The week that the 9th of Av falls out, we don't get haircuts or do laundry. But on Thursday, in preparation for Shabbat, you are allowed to do laundry. It would be okay. On the eve of Tisha B'Av, on the Erev Tisha B'Av, it's the Mishnah tells us that you cannot have 2 cooked dishes together, meaning what we would call a meal. You can only eat a little bit. The Gemara is going to explain what this means. And you don't eat wine, or you don't drink wine or eat meat. The Mishnah says that we should change our customs. Maybe we should overturn our beds, or you don't need to. And the Mishnah is going to explain this in a minute. since we talked about probably the saddest days of the year, the Gemara now says we're going to discuss the happiest days of the year. The happiest days of the year are what we call Tu B'Av, which is the 15th of Av, and Yom Kippur, which I think is fascinating because I think when we think about Yom Kippur in general, we think of fasting, suffering, difficulty, seriousness. But here, actually, the Mishnah tells us it's the happiest day of the year. Again, I would say the holiest day of the year, when we repent, when our prayers are answered, and therefore it's the happiest day of the year. The Mishnah explains what happened on the 15th of Av, on Tu B'Av. The girls, the maidens, the unmarried women would go out with borrowed white dresses, and they would dance in the vineyard. And men would come and they would choose a girl, and they would choose a girl based on their family background and not on beauty. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the Gemara. Okay, let's go to the Gemara on Daf 26. So we started with saying that 3 times a year, the Kohanim give blessings whenever they were davening, whenever they prayed. And again, maybe only on Yom Kippur, it's 4 times a day. Right, we know that Ne'ilah, which is the 4th prayer of the day, is really only said on Yom Kippur. It's not said on a fast day. So the Gemara kind of explains the Mishnah to say when there are 4 prayers, so there's Birkat Kohanim, there's the blessing of the priests on that day. And if it's only 3 prayers, so then it's only 3 prayers. Again, we don't do the blessings of the priests, the Birkat Kohanim, on Mincha in general, because we're concerned maybe they drank during lunch. Again, in the time of the Gemara and the Mishnah, people don't really drink water. The beverage that they drink is wine. So it's not like they're going to the bar, but they had wine during their meal at lunch. So we're concerned that they might be inebriated, and we know that the Kohanim are not allowed to give the blessings when they are inebriated, and therefore we don't do Birkat Kohanim, the blessings, during Mincha, which is in the afternoon. And therefore the Gemara says that on a fast day, you can, right? Because nobody's drinking, because you're not eating or drinking. Here, we have seen this language before. The Gemara says, right, the halacha is as such, or the minhag, the custom, right? Either it was the law that they did a certain way, or it was the custom, or it was what people did. And the Gemara explains that what's the difference between these 3 understandings. One is, if it's the law, then that's what they teach publicly. If it's the custom, then we don't teach it publicly, but privately, we tell people what the law is. And if it means nahagu, meaning that's what they did, so we don't say anything. And if that's what they do, so then we don't stop them. And here they say that the law is, according to Rabbi Meir, that again, that we do the blessings on Mincha on a fast day. So this is either what they did, or it was the law, and this is what they taught to do. The Torah talks about the blessings of the priests, the Birkat Kohanim, and right afterwards talks about the Nazir, the Nazirite. The reason that they're next to each other, the Gemara tells us, is to teach us, exactly as I said, right, that the Kohen cannot be drunk when he is blessing the people. But he's not similar in all aspects, in the sense that he can eat grapes, right? A Nazirite is not allowed to eat anything grape related. The Kohen is allowed to. Okay, we're now on the top of Daf 27, and back to the Maamadot. Again, what are these Maamadot? So the Gemara says that we have these Maamadot based on a verse that says that people need to be in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, when they bring a communal sacrifice, right? And therefore, right, we say that there are 24 Maamadot that correspond to the 24 Mishmarot, which is the shifts of priests, of Kohanim. And interestingly, the Gemara says that 12 of these would go to Yericho, to the city of Jericho, right? So basically, half would go to Jerusalem and half would go to Jericho in order to be able to supply water and food for the people in Jerusalem. There is a kind of a tangent, but it's an interesting concept about what is the main way to worship in the temple, right? We know that we bring sacrifices. We also know that the Leviim, the Levites, would sing at the same time. They would also play instruments. So here the Gemara tangentially discusses what is the main way to worship God other than the sacrifice. Is it the song that they're singing, meaning in Hebrew they say is the avodah bapeh, with their mouth, or is the avodah bakli, meaning with the musical instrument, right? Is the musical instrument seen as an inherent part of the worship, or is it seen as an accompaniment? And really it's the song that they're singing that is the main part of the worship. And there are practical applications, as we say in Aramaic, in Gemara language, we say there's a nafkamina, right? There's a practical application, meaning who can play the instruments? Does it need to be a Levi, somebody who, let's say, doesn't have any blemishes, a minor, an adult? So that's not really relevant here, but it's just an interesting idea. So the Gemara continues on Daf 27 to tell us that, again, we said that there were 24 mishmarot. So the Gemara tells us that there were originally only 8 mishmarot based on the children of Aharon, and this was established by Moshe. And then later on, Shmuel, the priest, the prophet, added 12. He made it into 16, and then later on, David established that they would be 24. Again, based on how many priests there were or how many families there were. It seems that there were 4 mishmarot, right? We said that there were 24 basically shifts of priests that would come to the temple, to the Beit HaMikdash. Only 4 of them came back from Bavel in order to build the Beit HaMikdash, right? Again, we have the first temple. Everybody goes into exile to Babylonia, to Bavel. And then we have the period that's called Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. Unfortunately, the Tanakh tells us that not everybody came back. It was limited in terms of how many people came back. So here is another proof to that. The Gemara tells us that only 4 of the 24 shifts came back to Israel, and therefore they took those 4 shifts and divided them into 24. So that there would be, again, 24 shifts. And the Gemara says which families came back. The main family is Yedaya. Yedaya becomes the head of the Mishmarot, like I guess he becomes the head of all of these shifts. And interestingly, the Gemara says that even if somebody else comes back later on, we don't take away these shifts from these 4 families, right? We give them a special privilege. So we said that the Maamadot read from the verses of the creation of the world, from Masechet. Why? Because the Gemara explains that God promised, if you bring a korbanot, if we bring sacrifices, so then the world won't be destroyed. So there's this connection between the creation of the world, or the existence of the world, and sacrifices. And therefore, while the Kohanim, the priests, are bringing the sacrifices, they are going to read about the creation of the world. So that's the connection. And the Ma'amad prays that these sacrifices will be accepted, right? Again, there's, this intrinsic connection between what's going on in in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, and what's going on in the shul, right, in the nation. And they're seen as going hand in hand. Each one is working for the other or praying for the other. So as we mentioned that on Monday, they're going to fast throughout the week. And the Gemara goes through how each day they're going to fast for somebody else. Again, the Kohanim are giving the sacrifices, again, as atonement for the people. And the people are praying for the nation. So on Monday, there's a fast for the seagoers. On Tuesday, there's a fast and they're praying for the travelers. On Wednesday, they're fasting for the people who are sick or that no one should get sick. On Thursday, they pray for the pregnant and nursing women. So I think it's really beautiful to think about how every day they're focused on another part of society, right? And it's a beautiful idea, this idea of communal prayer. And I think we actually have this in our daily prayer. When we look at the Shmona Esrei, the silent Amida, we have blessings that talk about our personal or individual needs and desires, but we also talk about more national desires. So it's interesting that this seems to parallel that as well. We mentioned that they don't fast on Friday. Again, it's not nice for Shabbat if we come in starving, so you don't fast on Friday. And you don't fast on Sunday, either because interestingly, the Gemara says because it's a holy day for the Christians and we don't want to maybe show that we're, I don't know, keeping their holidays, so we make sure that we don't fast. Or maybe it was the third day since the creation of man, right? Again, if man was created on Friday, so Friday, Shabbos, Sunday would be the third day. Remember, there's this concept of man being weak on the third day, right? Mankind being weak on the third day, so we're not going to fast. Or the idea of the neshama yetira, the extra soul that we get on Shabbat. So it leaves on Saturday night. So on Sunday, we're feeling very weak, and therefore we're not going to fast on Sunday, which is just an interesting idea. The Gemara goes into what's read every single day. And from here, we get the idea of every time you read from the Torah, we divide it into 3 sections, or what we call 3 aliyot. And we need there to be 3 verses in every aliyah. Interestingly, on the first day, there are only 5 verses. So the question is, how do you divide 5 into 3, three aliyot of 3 psukim each, of 3 verses each? It doesn't really work. Either you go back and repeat 1 verse, or you break up a verse in the middle, which we in general don't like that idea of breaking up verses. So there's a machloket, there's a disagreement whether we break it up or not. The top of daf 28, we talk about the fact that they read from the Torah in the morning, in Shacharit, in the morning prayer, and Musaf, in the additional prayer. And then in Mincha, in the afternoon prayer, you're going to say the same verses, but by heart, not read it from the Torah scroll. Remember, we said that when there was this sacrifice of the trees, so we didn't have a ma'amad. So now the Gemara is going to explain that again, during Shivat Zion, during the return to Zion, when the people came back, there was actually no wood for the Beit HaMikdash, for the temple. Again, the temple needs wood. We needed to burn on the altar, on the Mizbeach, and therefore families decided to volunteer to bring wood to the temple. And that day became a minor festival for that family. And it was called a Korban Eitzim. They brought a sacrifice of the wood, either of the wood or in addition to the wood. it said that, and then once the Gemara explains on Daf 28 that there was once a decree that you weren't allowed to bring wood to the temple, right? Again, the government didn't want people burning things on the altar, and they weren't allowed to bring the bikurim, the first fruit, to the temple. So what did they do? They actually put the wood in a basket, and then they covered it with dried figs, and then they brought it and they said, "Oh, we're not bringing a sacrifice to the temple. We're just on our way to the market to sell our figs." And then they would get there and they would take the wood and burn it on the altar, or they would take the wood again. Remember, we're trying to bring wood to the altar. What would they do? They would build ladders out of the wood and then just carry the ladders, right? They say, "Oh, we're going to fix something," and then when they'd get to the temple, they'd break down the ladders and then they would use that wood for the temple. So it's interesting, very creative ways to get around the decree. It says that King David's descendants brought wood twice to the temple, or maybe it was the descendants of Yoav. It's not sure who was the one that brought this wood. We said that when there was Hallel, when we say Hallel, there's no Ma'amad in the morning. And when there's Musaf, so there's no Ma'amad for Musaf. But there is for Mincha and Ni'ilah for later. The question is why? The Gemara explains that Hallel on Rosh Chodesh is actually not biblical in origin. It's not deoraita. Therefore, we will have a ma'amad on Rosh Chodesh, but not on other days. So from here, since we're talking about Hallel, the Gemara tells us that 18 times a year we say Hallel, right? And you can do the math on Sukkot, on Chanukah, on the beginning of Pesach. Here we're talking about full Hallel, the first day of Pesach, on Shavuot, and then on Chol HaMoed, right? And then so all of that is 21 days. And then Rosh Chodesh is not mentioned, again, because we said it's not deoraita, it's not biblical in origin, and that's why we only say partial Hallel on those days. Okay, from here, we're going to get to some, we talked about the breaking of the luchot, of the tablets, on the 17th of Tamuz. So now we're going to do some calculations. So the Gemara tells us that we received the 10 commandments on the 6th of Sivan or on the 7th. Either way, either we got it on the 6th and Moshe went up on the 7th, or we got it on the 7th and Moshe went up on the 7th. Either way, Moshe goes up on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai on the 7th. We know that he's on the mountain for 40 days. When he comes down, right, 40 days from the 7th of Sivan is the 17th of Tammuz, right? That's when he comes down and he breaks the tablets. How do we know that the Tamid was not brought anymore starting on the 17th of Tammuz? The Gemara says that it's a tradition that it stopped, right? It was just a tradition that we have, that's when it stopped. The walls were breached on the 17th of Tammuz. The Gemara says, but wait a minute, weren't the walls breached on the 9th of Tammuz? Again, Tammuz being around July. So the Gemara says that on the first temple, the walls were breached on the 9th, and on the second temple, it was on the 17th. But we commemorate the 17th since other things also happened on the 17th. There's a tradition, again, as we said, that the Torah, a Torah scroll was burnt on the 17th as well, and that there were 2 idols placed in the temple courtyard, but one fell on the other, and one of the idol's hands was broken. So that's why it says there was only one. but really there were two that were stood up in the courtyard. Daf 29 starts talking about the 9th of Av, again Tisha B'Av. As we mentioned, it's when the spies came back. Okay, let's do a little bit more calculations. The first month of the second year after they left Egypt. So on the first day, so that's on the 20th of Iyar again. Iyar is about let's say May, right in the spring. So the after they basically start traveling on the 20th of Iyar, they left Har Sinai. They were camped there the whole year. Then there were 30 days when the Jewish people complain in the desert that they don't have meat, and therefore they get 30 days of meat. That gets us to the 22nd of Sivan. Again, Sivan being around June. Then on the 29th of Sivan, they sent the spies. Again, there was 7 days that they didn't move because of Miriam, right, when she got leprosy. Then they send the spies on the 29th of Sivan. They were in Israel for 40 days. They were again checking out Israel for 40 days. The spies come back and the Jewish people cry out that they couldn't go into Israel, and that turns out on the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is also when the first temple, the first Beit HaMikdash, was destroyed. It says that it was burnt on the 7th of Av. It also says that it was burnt on the 10th. So we have 7 and 10. How do we get 9? You can ask. So the Gemara says that on the 7th, they actually went into the courtyard and they basically desecrated the courtyard. And then on the 9th, they actually lit the temple on fire, and it burnt till the 10th, right? This is this is the source for the idea that even when the 9th of Av is finished and it's the 10th and you think, oh, okay, now I can go back to doing everything. We can eat right away, but we actually don't start doing, let's say, laundry or things like that till the next day. This is the source because the temple was still burning on the 10th of Av. The Gemara says, well, if it was burning on the 10th, maybe we should commemorate on the 10th. Why do we commemorate on the 9th? And the Gemara says that we commemorate when the punishment starts, not when the majority of it happens, but when it actually began. And it began on the 9th of Av. The Gemara on Daf 29 continues and tells us that the second temple also was destroyed on the same day, on the 9th of Av. And this actually happens on a Saturday night on the end of Shemitah. I heard Rav Asaf Ben Narsh gave us a shiur on Shabbat, and he said that the idea here is that it's at the end of an era, right? It's the end of a week. It's the end of Shabbat. It's the end of Shemitah, right? And it basically symbolizes almost like the end of everything good and kind of the beginning of a new era of basically bad, right? Of a reality where we don't have a temple anymore. And therefore the Gemara talks about how, right, all the things align and it's the end of everything, or maybe the beginning of everything, right? The beginning of a new cycle of Shemitah, the beginning of a week. And all of these beginnings happen with the destruction, right? Or start off with the destruction of the temple. Beitar, we mentioned, the city of Beitar was destroyed. This too is a tradition, right? We mentioned that it's basically the destruction of the Bar Kokhba rebellion that happens 52 years after the destruction of the temple. And it also happens on that day, on the 9th of Av. So too the plowing of Jerusalem, right? Basically the raising of the city. Okay, Rabban Gamliel, actually, so we have a story about Rabban Gamliel being sentenced to be executed. And a Roman officer basically warns him and tells him that he's going to be executed. And he says to him, if I save you, will you bring me to the world to come? Will you give me a portion in the world to come? And Rabban Gamliel says, yes, I will. And what did he do? The Roman officer jumps off the roof and kills himself because it seems that there's a law in Rome that if an officer that was involved in creating a decree, if he dies, you cannot carry out the decree. So basically, this Roman officer gives up his life to save Rabban Gamliel. And a heavenly voice, a bat kol, comes out and says, this man is invited to Olam Haba, right? And he does get Olam Haba. So it's interesting that this story is here. I think maybe one idea is, first of all, that basically anyone can maybe merit the next world, the Olam Haba, right? Even if they're not Jewish, in order to save the Jewish people or a Jewish person. Maybe it's here to give hope. We're talking a lot about destruction and, death and all these terrible things. And maybe it's trying to show us that there were some good people out there, even in this culture of destruction at that time. Unfortunately, another sad story. During the destruction of the temple, there's another story that a group of young priests, of young Kohanim, went to the temple, and they had the keys, either figuratively or literally, in their hands, and they said, right, they yell out to God, and they said, we didn't really take care of your house. Here are the keys, right, and they throw the keys up or out, and it seems that a heavenly hand takes those keys, again, either figuratively or, if you want to believe, maybe literally. This idea of returning the keys to God, to heaven, right? Because we weren't worthy of the Beit HaMikdash, of keeping the Beit HaMikdash. And these young priests go up to the roof and they jump into the flames. So again, this idea of the end of an era, of destruction, of maybe some taking of responsibility by the Kohanim. So that's an interesting idea. As we talked about, what Misha Nichnas Av Mima'atim B'Simcha, when we start the month of Av, we lessen or we limit happiness. The flip side of that, and now we're going to start talking about the other side. The flip side of that is when we start Misha Nichnas Adar, I think very famously, Marbim B'Simcha. When we start Av, Adar, we increase happiness. So the Gemara says, right, if you need to go to court, you shouldn't go in Av, right, around August time. You should go in Adar around February, March, right? It is a happy time. Now we're going to talk a little bit about preparing ourselves maybe emotionally for Tisha B'Av. So there's this concept of the week that Tisha B'Av falls out. In Hebrew, it's called Shavua Shechal Bo, that has more, I would say, more severe customs. So again, as we said, we don't launder clothing and wear that laundered clothing, or maybe you can't launder even if you're not going to wear that clothing. If you only have one garment, you can wash it, even on Chol HaMoed when we're not supposed to be doing laundry. The Gemara talks about not wearing freshly laundered and pressed clothing before Tisha B'Av. After Tisha B'Av, even during that week, so let's say Tisha B'Av is on Wednesday, on Thursday and Friday, you can do laundry and you can wear freshly laundered clothing. Okay, the Gemara on Daf 30 tells us that there's this concept of what we call su'udat mafseket, a meal in preparation for the fast. This is not, when we say, let's all have dinner before Tisha B'Av, that's not the su'udat mafseket. Su'udat mafseket would be after you eat all the things you want to eat. We have a separate, almost commemorative meal, a mourner's meal. So this is the meal that we don't have cooked, two cooked dishes together. This is where some people sit on the floor to eat. Some people have accustomed to eat eggs at this time. As we mentioned, that we need to change our normal traditions. And here the Gemara talks about limiting what we eat for that meal. Or maybe it's limiting the number of people we normally eat with. Again, we talked about not drinking wine, not eating meat, not washing yourself in this time period. And there are customs of mourning, right, that we do on Tisha B'Av as well, right? We said again, not eating meat or milk, not eating meat or wine. You can't bathe, you can't learn Torah on Tisha B'Av, again, because learning Torah makes us happy, but you can learn certain sad portions, Eov, right, the book of Job. You can learn from Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, things that talk about the destruction of, you can learn Echa, Lamentations, right, things that talk about the destruction. The Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yehuda would eat like dry bread and some salt before Tisha B'Av, again in a mournful state in preparation. And the Gemara tells us that in different places they had different traditions about working on Tisha B'Av, right? Tisha B'Av is not like Shabbat. You do not have a law that you're not allowed to work. But in different places, the Gemara says, different places had a tradition whether or not you could work on that day or not. The Gemara tells us that fasting on Tisha B'Av is equated to fasting on Yom Kippur. That's why the laws are pretty strict when it comes to fasting on Tisha B'Av. Here, another idea that the Gemara says that if you fast for the destruction of the temple to commemorate the destruction, you will rejoice in its rebuilding, right? This idea, that's why we take it so seriously, fasting on Tisha B'Av. Some people say that you should sleep on the floor, right? You should be as uncomfortable as possible, not pregnant women or nursing women. But the Gemara concludes that no, you don't need to. You can sleep on your bed on Tisha B'Av. Okay, now let's move over to the festive days, right? We talked about the saddest days of the year. Now let's talk about the happiest days of the year. Remember we said Yom Kippur and Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av. Again, Yom Kippur is the happiest day of the year because it's a day of forgiveness. It's a day of spirituality. Why Tu B'Av? What happened on the 15th of Av? The Gemara is now going to give us a whole list of things that happen on the 15th of Av. One is that it's the day that the tribes were told that they were allowed to marry within, between tribes. If you remember, there was the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad, Benot Tzlofchad, who wanted to get the land, their inheritance from their father. And basically, Moshe told them that they could get the inheritance, but they had to marry within their tribe of Menashe. But afterwards, it was taught that only then did they have to stay within their tribe. All other girls were allowed to marry from one tribe to the other. Again, practically, it would mean that any land that the girl owned, which was very rare that the girl would own land, would go to the husband in another tribe, right? And we wanted to make sure that the land stayed separate and in different areas. Number two, what happened on the 15th of Av? They decided to let the children of the tribes, of the different tribes, marry into the tribe of Binyamin. This is after the terrible story of Pilegesh Bagiva, the harlot in Giva, which is in Binyamin. They're actually at the end of Sefer Shoftim, of the book of Judges. There's a terrible story of almost basically a civil war where all the tribes gang up against Binyamin because they do terrible things. They swear they're not going to let their children marry the offspring of Shevet Binyamin. They realize that that's not viable since they kill a lot of Shevet Binyamin. So on Tu B'Av, they decide, it's okay for our children to marry into our daughters and to marry into Shevet Binyamin, or our children to marry Shevet Binyamin. I think it was the daughters. Okay, what else happened on Tu B'Av? It's the day that the people in the desert stopped dying. Remember, there are 40 years where an entire generation of people die out. They stop dying on the 15th of Av. It's also the day that they removed the guards that Yeravam put up in order to prevent the people from going to Jerusalem. So again, another happy day. Daf 31, our last daf, tells us that it's also the day that the people who were killed in Beitar, remember we talked about the massacre in Beitar, on Tu B'Av, they were finally buried. And the Gemara explains to us that on that day in Yavne, they wrote the blessing of Hatov v'Hametiv that we say in Birkat Hamazon, in benching every day. So the blessing of Tova v'Hametiv was added because of the people of Beitar being able to be buried. The last thing that happened on Tu B'Av was the day that they stopped cutting wood for the altar, again, for the year. Again, this is happening around August time. So they want to make sure that they have all the wood that they need by Tu B'Av in preparation for the winter. The Gemara here then expands on the story that we mentioned before of the girls. What happened on Tu B'Av? So the girls would borrow clothing from each other so that no one would be embarrassed if they didn't own the clothing. So they would each borrow from each other. They would actually immerse all the clothing in the mikvah because we didn't know whose clothing was pure or impure, so they immersed everything, again, not to embarrass anybody. And the men would come to the vineyard to find a wife. And interestingly, each woman would say something, right? So if they were beautiful, they would say, look at my beauty. If they were less beautiful but came from important families, they would say, look at my lineage, my yichus, as we would say, right? Look at my family. If they were not so pretty and didn't come from good families, they would say, take me l'shem shamayim, right? Because it's good for God, or because God wants you to, right? This idea that there's someone for everyone out there. And the Gemara talks about the girls dancing, mecholot. Mechol also means like in circles, so they would dance in circles. And since we're talking about dancing in circles, the Gemara here ends about, right, we're talking about the girls dancing in circles in order to find a partner. And here the Gemara is going to end the Masechet by talking about God making a circle for the righteous people in the next world. And God is going to sit in the middle, and they say, right, Hine Elokeinu Zeh, right? They point to God and they say, this is our God, and we will rejoice in his salvation. And I think it's a really beautiful way to end our Masechet. Again, to remind us, we talked in this Masechet about times of, I would say, tragedy, specifically at the end of the Masechet, but even at the beginning of the Masechet, we talked about times where we don't really see God, right? There's rain, there's drought, there's famine, there are terrible things happening in Israel, and we're calling out to God. And if you remember, we talked about God answering, sometimes God not answering, God answering certain people and not other people. And I think here the Gemara is really ending on this beautiful note about the recognition that God is really there, right? God is at the center of everything. We don't always see him, but definitely in the next world, it will be very obvious that God is always at the center. And I think that that's really meant to inspire us, that when times are really hard, right? Again, we went from talking about the most, I would say, the most tragic day in Jewish history or of the Jewish calendar to the happiest day of the Jewish calendar, right? Our lives are really cyclical. Again, here's that circle again, that we unfortunately experience tragedy, but we also experience happiness. And I think really it's about balancing. It's about finding the good that's in our lives. If you remember, we talked about stories about people being so poor. I remember Nachum Ish Gamzu, who says, right, everything is Gamzu Letova. So I think that really this Masechet was very inspirational in terms of being humble, seeing the good in our lives, being aware of God in our lives, and with that we finish Masechet Taanit. May we be zoche to see only good things and only celebrations. And as we say, Hadran Alach Masechet Taanit, right? We will return to you, Masechet Taanit. I really hope all of you who have learned the Masechet will have a party, have a Siyum. I'm very passionate about making a Siyum. I think that it's important to celebrate with friends, with family, with loved ones, your accomplishments. I think that it really inspires other people to learn. And Be'ezrat Hashem, officially we start Masechet Megillah on Tuesday, which is interesting, which is a fast day, actually. So we're finishing Masechet Taanit the day before a fast. We really finish tomorrow. So we're going to start Masechet Megillah on Tuesday. And next week, we're going to go back to our regular schedule. So sorry for all the confusion. So next week, we'll go back to our regular schedule, and I'll give you an introduction to Masechet Megillah. We're going to talk about, obviously, Megillat Esther. We're going to talk about Purim and the laws of Purim and when we read the Megillah, and all the very famous stories of the Midrashim, the stories about Megillat Esther are all going to be found in this Masechet. So looking forward to our continued learning and wishing everybody a Shavuot Tov and Mazal Tov on finishing the Masechet.
Take care. Get some sleep.
Thank you. Shavuot Tov. Yes.